Have you ever felt like something was watching you, hidden just out of sight? In forests, rivers, and abandoned places, strange creatures roam where most never dare to go. If you enjoy this video, consider liking, subscribing, and hitting the bell notification. I would also love to know where you are watching from. Now, let's begin. It all started back in the summer of 2007, or maybe it was 2008. The years kind of blur together now when I think about it. I was living with my parents in rural Ohio, in one of those houses that's just far enough from town that you can't see your neighbors, but not so far that you feel like you're completely cut off from the world. Our property was decent sized, about 10 acres, mostly wooded with a shallow creek that cut through the back half. It was the kind of place where you get used to the sounds of nature. The coyotes yipping at night, the owls, the cicadas in the summer. You learn the rhythm of it, and anything that breaks that rhythm stands out. My dog, a big, goofy golden retriever named Gus, was usually the first to notice. He was a good dog, but not particularly brave. Mostly, he just wanted to chase squirrels and sleep on the cool tile in the kitchen. The first odd thing was the tapping. It would happen late at night, usually after my parents had gone to bed and I was up playing video games or watching TV. It was a faint sound, like a single fingernail tapping on my bedroom window. The first few times, I figured it was a branch hitting the glass in the wind, even if the night was still. I'd pause my game, listen, and hear nothing. Gus, who usually slept at the foot of my bed, would lift his head, his ears perked, and let out a low growl that was more confused than aggressive. He would stare at the window for a minute straight before lying back down with a huff. This went on for a couple of weeks, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. It was just frequent enough to be strange, but not alarming enough for me to make a big deal out of it. I just started keeping my blinds closed at night. Then the sounds from the woods started changing. We were used to coyotes, but this was different. It was a cry, almost like a woman screaming, but the sound was wrong. It was too high-pitched, and it would get cut off abruptly, like someone hitting pause on a recording. It also sounded like it was moving incredibly fast. 1 second it would sound like it was down by the creek, a good 200 yards away, and the next it would sound like it was right at the edge of our yard. Gus hated it. The nights it happened, he would refuse to go outside for his last bathroom break. He'd stand at the back door, whining, with his tail tucked between his legs, and no amount of coaxing would get him to step onto the porch. My dad, who had lived in the country his whole life, just brushed it off. "Foxes," he'd say. "They make some god-awful noises, but I'd heard foxes before, and this wasn't that." It lacked the animalistic quality. It felt hollow, somehow. The first time I saw something, I wasn't even sure I'd seen it at all. I was taking the trash out to the cans we kept at the end of our long gravel driveway. It was dusk, that time of evening when the world turns gray and blue and shadows play tricks on your eyes. As I was walking back towards the house, a movement at the edge of the woods caught my attention. It was pale and fast. For a second, my brain registered it as a deer, but it was too low to the ground, and it moved in a way that just felt wrong. It wasn't the smooth, four-legged gait of an animal. It was jerky, like a stop-motion animation. It scrambled from the cover of one cluster of trees to another, a flash of white against the dark woods, and then it was gone. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the spot where I thought I saw it. The evening chorus of crickets and frogs suddenly seemed deafening, and I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I sprinted back to the house and locked the door behind me, feeling ridiculous but unable to shake the image of that jerky, unnatural movement. Things escalated from there. My mom had a bird feeder hanging from a low branch of an oak tree in the backyard. One morning we woke up and it was gone. Not on the ground, not broken. The hook was still in the branch, but the entire feeder, a heavy-duty plastic thing, had vanished. A few days later, my dad found it down by the creek. It was wedged high up in the fork of a tree, at least 20 feet off the ground. There was no way a raccoon or a bear could have gotten it up there. It would have taken a person, and a person with a ladder at that. There were no footprints around the base of the tree either. The ground was soft from a recent rain, but it was completely undisturbed. That was the first time I saw my dad look genuinely unsettled. He didn't say anything about foxes that time. He just took the feeder down, threw it in the trash, and told us to make sure the doors were always locked, even during the day. The real terror, for me, came with the mimicry. I was in the kitchen one afternoon making a sandwich. The back door was open, but the screen door was latched. Gus was lying on the porch, dozing in the Sunday from the edge of the woods. Clear as day, I heard my mom call my name. "Michael, come here a second." It was her voice. The exact pitch, the exact cadence. But I knew she wasn't home. She and my dad had gone into town for groceries an hour earlier. I froze, my hand hovering over the bread. Gus shot up from a dead sleep, a deep, rumbling growl starting in his chest. He stood at the edge of the porch, staring intently into the woods, the fur on his back ridged. I slowly walked to the screen door, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Mom?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no answer, just the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then I heard it again, this time from a different spot, further to the left. "Michael." It was still my mom's voice, but this time it had a strange, tinny quality to it, like it was being played through a cheap speaker. Gus started barking, a frantic, terrified sound I'd never heard from him before. I slammed the main door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. When my parents got home 45 minutes later, I asked my mom if she'd somehow come back early. She looked at me like I was crazy. They'd been in the supermarket the whole time. The final straw happened about a week after that. It was late, close to midnight. I had let Gus out for one last run and was standing on the back porch, waiting for him. The porch light was on, casting a yellow semicircle that pushed the darkness back about 30 feet. Gus was sniffing around at the edge of the light when he suddenly froze, staring out into the pitch-black yard. He didn't growl or bark. He just stood there, completely rigid, and let out a soft whimper. I called his name, trying to coax him back. He wouldn't move. "Gus, come on, boy. Let's go." That's when I saw it step into the light. It came from the direction of the creek, moving slowly, deliberately. It was on all fours, but it was not an animal. It was long and emaciated, with limbs that seemed too long for its torso. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and looked slick, like a salamander's. It had no fur, no discernible features on its head from what I could see, just a smooth, rounded shape. But the way it moved was the most horrifying part. It moved its limbs one at a time, a slow, disjointed crawl that was completely silent. It would plant one long, spindly arm forward, then drag its body, then plant the other arm. It was like watching a broken marionette trying to pull itself across the ground. It stopped just at the edge of the light, its body still mostly in shadow, and it lifted its head. I couldn't see eyes, but I absolutely knew, it was looking right at me. A guttural, clicking sound came from it, like rocks being scraped together. And then, in a perfect imitation of my own voice, it whispered, "Let's go." I don't remember screaming. I just remember grabbing Gus by the collar and yanking him inside, slamming and locking the door. I shoved a chair under the doorknob and backed away, my eyes glued to the window. The thing crawled a few more feet into the light. It turned its head from side to side, a slow, inquisitive motion. Then it slowly, deliberately stood up. It unfolded itself, rising onto two impossibly long legs. It must have been 7 or 8 feet tall. It stood there in my backyard, in the yellow glow of the porch light, for what felt like an eternity. It didn't do anything else. It just stood there, a tall, pale, stick-thin silhouette against the darkness. Then, just as slowly as it appeared, it folded itself back down onto all fours and crawled back into the shadows, disappearing as silently as it came. We moved out 2 months later. We didn't sell the house. My dad couldn't bring himself to do it, but he rented it out to a couple who he never told about what happened. We moved into a subdivision closer to the city, with street lights and neighbors you could see from your window. I never heard the tapping again, and I never heard my voice called from the woods. But sometimes, when it's late and quiet, I think about that thing unfolding itself in my backyard. I think about how it learned my mom's voice and then mine. I think about it listening, watching, from the dark woods around that house. I don't know what it was or what it wanted. I only know that it was intelligent, and it was not from any part of the natural world I ever want to see again. It was Mike's idea to go camping in that specific stretch of forest. He was a photographer, always chasing the perfect light, and he'd read online about this particular old growth stand, a place where the trees were so tall and thick that the forest floor was in a state of perpetual twilight. Chloe and I were just along for the hike and the escape from the city. We weren't pros like Mike, but we both had decent cameras and enjoyed the hobby. We drove out on a Friday in early October, parked at a little used trailhead, and hiked for about 4 hours, heading deeper into the woods than any of us had ever been before. The scale of the place was hard to process. The trees, mostly massive Douglas firs, were like skyscrapers. Standing at the base of one and looking up was dizzying. You couldn't see the tops. We found a small, flattish clearing next to a creek to set up our tents. It felt like we were the only people for 100 miles. The first weird thing happened while we were pitching our tents. Chloe suddenly brushed at her hair and looked straight up. "Is it raining?" she asked. I looked up too. The canopy was a dense, dark green ceiling far above us, but I could see patches of clear sky. It wasn't raining. Then a small clump of damp moss and dirt fell and landed on my shoulder. We all looked up again. A slow, steady shower of forest debris was drifting down on our campsite. Not just leaves and pine needles, but bits of bark, pebbles, and dirt. It was coming from one specific area directly over our heads. "Must be a big squirrel's nest or something up there," Mike said, squinting. "Something's digging around." It seemed like a logical explanation, so we shrugged it off and finished setting up. The light started to fail quickly, as it does in those deep woods, and Mike got busy with his camera, trying to capture the last rays filtering through the canopy. Chloe and I got a small campfire going. An hour later, we were sitting around the fire, eating our dehydrated meals when Mike came over, a strange look on his face. He was holding his camera. "Guys, look at this. This is weird." He showed us the small screen on the back. He had been using a powerful telephoto lens to shoot straight up into the branches. The picture he showed us was of a colossal branch, probably 150 feet above the ground. It was thick as a car and covered in moss and coarse bark. "Okay, it's a branch," I said. "So what?" "Wait," he said, and used the controls to zoom in on one specific section of the image. The digital zoom made the image grainy, but we could see what he meant. In one area, the texture of the bark was wrong. Instead of the random, chaotic pattern of natural bark, it looked organized. It was a series of overlapping, diamond-shaped plates, almost like shingles on a roof or the scales on a reptile. And the whole patch had a shape to it, a kind of flattened, oblong form that just didn't look like part of the tree. "It's probably just a weird fungus," Chloe said, though she sounded uncertain. "Or a burl." But it didn't look like any burl I'd ever seen. It was too symmetrical, too deliberate. We stared at the tiny, unsettling image for a while longer before Mike put the camera away. We tried to laugh it off, but the mood had shifted. The forest suddenly felt a lot darker. I woke up in the middle of the night needing to use the bathroom. It was completely black inside my tent, and the only sound was the gurgle of the nearby creek. As I lay there, trying to summon the will to go outside, I heard a new sound. It was coming from high above, from the canopy. It was a tearing noise, a wet, ripping sound, followed by a heavy, cracking crunch. It sounded like a massive piece of wet canvas being torn in half. I froze, listening. The sound stopped, and then I heard something else. A drip, a slow, steady, thick-sounding drip landing on the rainfly of my tent. It wasn't rain. The sky had been clear when we went to bed, and this was a solitary, rhythmic sound. Drip, drip, drip. It sounded heavier than water. My imagination went into overdrive. I pictured some huge bird of prey tearing apart a catch, or that squirrel Mike mentioned, dropping something from its nest, but the sound was too heavy, too visceral. I lay there for what must have been an hour, listening to the steady, thick dripping, until I finally fell into a tense, uneasy sleep. The next morning, the dripping had stopped. I crawled out of my tent and saw Mike and Chloe already up, standing near the creek, staring up into the trees with pale faces. I followed their gaze. Wedged in the crook of a massive branch, directly above where my tent had been, was the carcass of a deer. It was at least 80 feet off the ground. It was torn open, its entrails hanging down in long, glistening ropes. One of its legs was bent back at an impossible angle, the bone jutting out. Dark blood had stained the trunk of the tree in a long, vertical smear all the way down. We just stood there in stunned silence. A mountain lion could, in theory, drag a kill into a tree, but not like this, not this high. And the way it was mangled, it looked like it had been torn apart by immense force, not neatly eaten. We knew we had to leave. We didn't even discuss it. The silent agreement was absolute. We started packing our gear with a frantic, clumsy urgency, constantly glancing up at the canopy. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was a physical pressure, like being at the bottom of a deep ocean. That's when the debris started falling again, heavier this time. A shower of twigs and clumps of moss rained down on us, and we heard movement. It wasn't the light scuttling of a squirrel. It was a heavy, dragging rustle, the sound of significant weight being shifted through the high branches. It moved from the tree with the carcass to the one next to it, and the one next to that, shadowing our position. "What is that?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. We were all frozen, looking up. "I don't know," Mike said, his voice barely audible. We were exposed, utterly vulnerable in this little clearing. The rustling stopped. For a few seconds, there was absolute silence, except for the sound of our own ragged breathing. "Let's just go," I said, my voice cracking. "Now." And as we turned to grab our packs, Chloe screamed, a raw, piercing shriek of pure terror. She was pointing straight up. We looked, and we saw it. Plastered flat against the trunk of a fir tree, about halfway up, was a shape. It took my brain a moment to separate it from the bark it was imitating. It was huge, maybe 10 feet long and flat, like a pressed leaf. Its color was a perfect mottled brown and gray, an exact match for the tree. It had limbs, too many limbs, sprouting from its body at odd angles. They were long and thin, like a spider's legs, and they were pressed into the crevices of the bark. It had no discernible head or face, just a central, chitinous mass. As we stared in frozen horror, it moved. It detached from the trunk with a fluid, silent motion and flowed into a thick cluster of branches, its multi-jointed legs pulling it along with a speed that defied its size. It moved like nothing I have ever seen, a nightmare combination of an insect and a falling shadow. We didn't need any more encouragement. We ran. We left a tent, sleeping bags, half our expensive camera gear. We didn't care. We bolted down the trail, our lungs burning, our packs bouncing wildly on our backs, and we could hear it following us. that heavy rustling sound in the canopy, keeping pace with us just out of sight. It was a sound I will never forget. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves from above, was it? We were being hunted. We didn't dare look up again. We just ran, stumbling over roots, splashing through mud, driven by a primal fear I didn't know I was capable of. After what felt like an eternity, we burst out of the tree line and saw our car at the trailhead. We threw our remaining gear into the back, piled in, and I have never been so happy to hear the sound of a locking car door. We drove away, leaving a cloud of dust behind us, and we didn't speak for the first 20 miles. I don't go hiking anymore. I don't even like public parks with too many trees. Sometimes, on a windy day, I'll see the branches of a large tree swaying and my heart will seize up. I find myself looking up, always looking up, scanning the patterns of the bark, searching for something that doesn't belong. I know what can live in the canopy, silent and unseen, and I know that we are not always at the top of the food chain. I haven't told many people this story, not the whole truth of it anyway. It happened when I was 22, back in 2011. My best friend at the time, a guy named Dylan, was obsessed with fishing. He wasn't just a casual weekend guy either. He was one of those people who would spend weeks researching forgotten lakes and old river tributaries, convinced he could find some untouched spot full of monster fish. He'd bought a beat-up 14-foot John boat, and we'd spend our weekends exploring the countless waterways and bayous that spiderweb through the marshlands of the deep south. I was mostly along for the ride. I just liked being out on the water, away from everything. It was Dylan who heard about the place he called the Sunken Cathedral. It was supposedly a deep, secluded pond, connected to the main river by a series of narrow, winding channels, where the cypress trees grew so thick they formed a canopy. The story was that the water was incredibly deep and clear, and nobody ever went there. It took us most of a Saturday to even find the channel he thought would lead us there. It was late afternoon by the time we left the wide, muddy river and entered the tight waterway. The trees immediately closed in around us. The air grew still and heavy, and the sunlight was cut into thin stripes that filtered through the thick canopy of cypress and Spanish moss. The only sound was the low whine of our little 9-horsepower outboard motor and the slap of water against the aluminum hull. Dylan was navigating with a crumpled, hand-drawn map he'd gotten from some old-timer at a bait shop. It was getting darker in the maze of channels than it was out on the open river, and I was starting to get a bad feeling. Maybe we should head back. I said, "We're gonna lose the light soon." Dylan just shook his head, his eyes fixed on the waterway ahead. "We're close, man. I can feel it." We came into the pond just as the sun was setting. It was exactly as described. A perfectly circular body of dark, still water, surrounded by a wall of ancient cypress trees whose roots, or knees, stuck out of the water like crooked bones. It was eerily quiet. No birds, no frogs, nothing. Just dead silence. We cut the motor and just drifted for a minute, the boat gliding across the glassy surface. Even Dylan seemed a little taken aback by the profound stillness of the place. We cast our lines a few times, but it was a pointless gesture. It was getting too dark to see. We didn't get a single bite. "All right, you win," Dylan finally said, reeling in his line. "Let's go." That was when the real trouble started. Dylan pulled the cord on the motor. Nothing. He pulled it again and again. It sputtered once, coughed out a puff of blue smoke, and went silent. We spent the next half hour taking turns yanking on that cord, checking the fuel line, messing with the choke, everything we could think of. The motor was dead. As total darkness fell, a deep, primal kind of dark you only get in places with no artificial light for miles, we accepted we were stranded. We had a couple of flashlights, some water, and a bag of chips. We figured our only option was to wait for morning and try to paddle our way out. It was while we were sitting there in the dark, just listening to the silence, that I saw the light. It was in the water, maybe 30 yards from the boat. A soft, pulsing glow, the color of a faint blue emerald. It was beautiful and completely out of place. "What is that?" I whispered, pointing my flashlight beam towards it, but the beam just reflected off the surface of the black water. It couldn't penetrate deep enough. Dylan was mesmerized. "It's gotta be foxfire," he said, referring to bioluminescent fungi that can grow on rotting wood. Maybe a whole log of it sunk down there. The light began to move. It wasn't drifting with a current. The water was perfectly still. It was moving with purpose, a slow, deliberate circle around our boat, staying deep. My initial curiosity curdled into a cold dread. That was not a log. We watched it for what felt like an hour, our flashlight beams uselessly tracing its path from the surface. Then, we felt the first bump. It was a solid, heavy thud against the bottom of the hull, right under my feet. It was strong enough to make the boat rock in the water. I nearly jumped out of my skin. "What was that?" Dylan asked, his voice tense. "Gator," I said, trying to convince myself more than him. "Just a big gator bumping us. But alligators surface. They float." This thing was staying deep, and it was circling. The bump came again, harder this time. A deep, resonant thud that vibrated through the whole boat. Then came the sound. It was a wet, rhythmic clicking noise. It came from just off the port side of the boat. It was a biological sound, thick and guttural. It sounded like someone slowly forcing air through a throat full of water. Click, click, gurgle. Click, click, gurgle. We both froze, straining our ears in the oppressive darkness. The light in the water stopped circling. It was stationary now, right next to the boat, maybe 10 feet down, and it started to get brighter, and it started to rise. We watched, transfixed in horror, as the pulsing emerald glow ascended through the black water. It wasn't a school of something, it was a single point of light. As it broke the surface, we saw what it was attached to. Dangling from a thin, fleshy stalk was a luminescent orb, pulsing softly. The stalk itself grew from the head of a creature that lifted itself silently from the water. Its skin was smooth and dark, like wet leather or a seal's hide. Its body was huge and bulky, most of it still submerged, but the head and shoulders were clear of the water. The head was wide and flat, and its eyes were massive, perfectly round black orbs that reflected no light. They were just voids. It had no discernible nose, just 2 vertical slits that flared slightly as it breathed, making that horrible, wet, clicking sound. It opened its mouth, and there were no teeth, just hard, pale gums, like a turtle's beak. It stared at us, its glowing lure swaying gently just above the water's surface. It was a predator, and its light was not for us to admire. Its light was to draw things in. It was pure, silent, intelligent malice. Time seemed to stop. We were paralyzed. The creature just watched us, its huge black eyes unblinking. It was so close I could have reached out and touched it. Then, with a suddenness that was terrifying, it moved. A long, 3-fingered hand with thick webbing between the digits reached out of the water and grabbed the side of our boat. The claws, or nails, were long and black, and they scraped against the aluminum. That single action broke the spell. Dylan screamed, a raw, panicked sound. He grabbed one of the short wooden paddles from the bottom of the boat and, with all his strength, swung it at the creature's head. The paddle connected with a sickening, wet thwack. The creature let out a shriek. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was a high-pitched, whistling sound, like air being forced out of a punctured tire. It recoiled, its hand slipping from the boat, and for a second I thought it was retreating, but it lunged again, this time hitting the boat with its full weight. The world turned upside down. The boat capsized, and I was thrown into the shockingly cold black water. My flashlight was gone. The darkness was absolute. I came up sputtering, gasping for air, my clothes like a lead weight. My only thought was to get out of the water. I could see the dark shape of the bank, the cypress knees sticking out like daggers. I swam, a frantic, clumsy breaststroke, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I heard Dylan yelling my name from somewhere behind me. "Alex! Alex!" I reached the bank and clawed my way out of the water, slipping on the slick mud and tangled roots. I turned back, shouting his name. Dylan. In the darkness, I saw the pulsing emerald light. It was moving fast, cutting through the water, heading right for the sound of Dylan's voice. I saw him thrashing in the water, trying to swim for the overturned boat. Then the light was upon him. I heard him scream one last time, a sound that was cut off with a horrifying final gulp. There was a tremendous splash, a violent churning of the water, and then silence. The emerald light submerged, faded, and was gone. I was alone in the pitch black, with only the memory of that scream and the wet clicking sound, which I could now hear faintly, moving away deeper into the sunken cathedral. I spent the rest of the night crouched on that muddy bank, shaking uncontrollably, starting at every sound. When the first gray light of dawn finally broke, I started walking. I followed the edge of the water, pushing through thorns and mud for hours until I finally stumbled back out into the main channel. A pair of fishermen found me later that morning, delirious and babbling. They called the sheriff. They searched for Dylan for 3 days. They found the boat, its hull scraped and dented. They never found a trace of him. The official report said he drowned and his body was likely taken by an alligator, dragged into a deep hole to be eaten later. I never corrected them. What could I say? That my friend was taken by a creature with a light on its head that lived in a place that doesn't exist on any map? They would have locked me up. I moved away a year later. I can't be near lakes or rivers or any dark water now. Every time I close my eyes, I see that pulsing emerald light, and I hear my friend's last scream echo across the water. Story 2. In the fall of 1999, I was part of a 3-person team contracted for a geological survey in a remote part of Washington. Our job was to spend 6 weeks taking core samples in a valley that was being considered for logging, to assess soil stability and mineral composition. The team consisted of myself, my name is Chloe, I was the junior geologist on the project. Then there was Frank, our supervisor, a guy in his late 50s who had been doing this kind of work since before I was born. And there was a younger guy named Kevin, an intern fresh out of college, mostly there to help with the heavy lifting and camp maintenance. Our setup was pretty standard for this kind of remote work. We had a small, generator-powered trailer that served as our lab and communications hub, and we each had our own personal all-weather tent for sleeping. We were miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by nothing but old-growth forest and the kind of quiet that feels heavy. For the first week, everything was completely normal. We established a routine. Wake up, run the generator for coffee, head out to a pre-designated grid point, drill a sample, log it, and hike back to camp. The work was physically demanding but simple. The only sounds were our equipment, the wind in the massive fir trees, and the occasional call of a bird. The problems started subtly, with a smell. It would appear just after sunset, a sharp, unpleasant odor that would drift through the camp. It wasn't the smell of a skunk or a dead animal. It was chemical, almost industrial. The closest I can describe it is a mix of ammonia and rotting vegetation, a pungent, acidic smell that would catch in the back of your throat and make your eyes water. Frank, with all his years of experience, had never smelled anything like it. We'd walk the perimeter of the camp with flashlights, looking for a source, a possible chemical spill from old mining equipment or a weird fungal bloom, but we never found anything. The smell would linger for an hour or two, then vanish as mysteriously as it arrived. A few days after the smell started, we found the first ground disturbance. It was about 100 yards south of our camp, in a small clearing. An area of earth, roughly 10 feet in diameter, had been completely churned up. It wasn't like a bear had been digging for roots. This was different. The soil was piled into strange, deep furrows and mounds, and the sheer volume of displaced dirt was incredible. It looked like someone had come in with a small backhoe and just clawed at the ground for a while. But there were no tracks leading to or from the site. No human footprints, no tire marks, nothing. The forest floor around it was untouched. Kevin was spooked by it. He thought maybe it was a prank, that some local loggers were messing with us, but that made no sense. We were incredibly isolated, and the effort it would take to haul machinery in just to dig a hole and leave no trace was ridiculous. Frank examined the soil and couldn't come up with a logical explanation. He mumbled something about possible geothermal activity, maybe a steam vent trying to blow, but he didn't sound convinced himself. The digging continued, getting closer to our camp each night. We'd wake up to find a new patch of forest floor torn apart, always with the same trackless, inexplicable precision. The overturned earth reeked of that same sharp ammonia smell. It was unnerving, to say the least. We started keeping the high-powered floodlights on the generator running all night, illuminating the camp and the immediate tree line. It didn't seem to make a difference. The digging just happened right outside the range of the lights. Around this time, a new sound started. It was a low, resonant grinding noise. It wasn't an animal call. It was a mechanical, scraping sound that seemed to vibrate up from the ground itself. The first time I heard it, I was in my tent trying to read. I actually thought it was the generator having issues, but when I went outside, the generator was humming along just fine. The sound was coming from the dark woods, and it felt like it was coming from deep underground. It was a sound you feel in your teeth and your bones. It would go on for 10 to 20 minutes at a time, a slow, rhythmic scrape and grind that was deeply unsettling. The tension in the camp was becoming unbearable. Kevin was barely sleeping, and even Frank, who usually maintained a calm, professional demeanor, was visibly on edge. We started doing our survey work in pairs, never letting anyone go off alone. We were all armed. Frank had a high-caliber rifle he kept in the trailer, and I had a shotgun I started carrying with me whenever I left my tent. We were supposed to radio in a weekly progress report, and Frank was seriously considering calling the project off. The company wouldn't be happy about the financial loss, but something was clearly wrong in that valley. He decided we would give it 2 more days. If the activity continued, we were packing up and leaving. Official report be damned. The last night was the night the storm rolled in. The weather had been clear for weeks, but that evening the sky turned a bruised purple and the wind picked up, whipping through the trees with a mournful howl. The rain started just after 10 o'clock, a torrential downpour that hammered against the roof of the trailer. We had all decided to stay in the trailer that night, nobody wanting to be isolated in their tents. About an hour into the storm, with a loud pop and a fizz, the generator died. We were plunged into absolute darkness and a sudden, shocking silence, broken only by the sound of the rain and the wind. Frank tried to get the generator going again, but it was no use. The ignition was flooded or fried, so we sat there in the dark, with just a couple of flashlights for illumination, listening to the storm rage outside. The grinding sound started up again, but this time it was different. It was louder, more frantic, and it sounded like it was right outside. It was coming from multiple directions at once, a chorus of subterranean scraping that made the whole trailer vibrate slightly. Kevin was having a full-blown panic attack, just rocking back and forth in his chair, whispering to himself. Frank had his rifle across his lap, his flashlight beam trained on the trailer's single door. I was near the main window, peering out into the blackness, trying to see something, anything. Then the lightning started. It wasn't frequent, but when it came, it was brilliant. a huge sheet of white light that would illuminate the entire valley for a second, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. It was during the third or fourth flash that I saw it. The bolt of lightning lit up the clearing where our tents were, and in that split second, I saw something moving. It was emerging from a new hole, a massive pit of churned earth not 50 feet from the trailer. It was huge, low to the ground, and its body was a dark, glistening black. It looked segmented, like a colossal insect or a crustacean. It had multiple limbs, thin and sharp, that were pulling its bulk from the earth. The lightning faded, plunging everything back into darkness. I wasn't sure if I had really seen it, if my mind, frayed from weeks of stress, had just created a nightmare out of the shadows. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came out. Another flash of lightning. This time it was closer to the trailer. I could see the texture of its body. It was like wet chitin, reflecting the light. It didn't have a head in the traditional sense, just a rounded, featureless front that was angled towards the ground. It was pulling itself along, digging its sharp limbs into the mud, moving with a horrifying, unnatural speed. The thunder that followed was so loud it shook the trailer. I heard a choked gasp next to me and realized Frank had seen it too. "Into the truck," he said, his voice a low, steady command that cut through the noise of the storm and Kevin's panicked breathing. Now. We didn't need to be told twice. We didn't grab anything. Not our personal gear, not the expensive survey equipment. Nothing. Frank led the way with his rifle and a flashlight, and I practically dragged Kevin behind me. We scrambled out of the trailer and into the torrential rain. As we ran for our Ford F-250 parked nearby, another flash of lightning lit up the sky. I risked a glance back. There wasn't just one. There were 3 of them now. They were out of their holes, crawling around the camp, their segmented bodies glistening in the rain. They were tearing at the empty tents, ripping the heavy canvas apart with their sharp limbs, making that horrible scraping sound as their bodies dragged through the mud. We piled into the truck, and Frank got it started. The engine roared to life, and he slammed it into 4-wheel drive. The tires spun in the thick mud as he gunned it, and for a terrifying moment I thought we were stuck. Then the tires caught, and we lurched forward, fishtailing wildly down the muddy track that served as our road. I didn't look back. None of us did. We just drove, hydroplaning and sliding all the way back to the main logging road. We didn't stop until we hit pavement and the lights of a small town an hour later. The official story we gave was that a bear, or several bears, had become unusually aggressive and destroyed our camp, forcing an emergency evacuation. The company accepted it, wrote off the lost equipment, and the project in that valley was indefinitely suspended. The 3 of us never worked together again. We never spoke about what we really saw that night. There's no scientific classification for what was digging under that valley. All I know is that they live deep in the earth, and sometimes they come up. Story 4. My uncle got me the job. He knew the owner, some wealthy guy from the city who'd bought a huge tract of land up in the mountains and needed someone to just live on it. He called it a caretaker position, but there wasn't much to take care of. The main house was miles away, where he stayed a few weeks out of the year. My job was to live in the small, 1-bedroom cabin near the front gate, make sure the fences were intact, and generally just be a presence on the property to deter squatters or poachers. It was easy money for a 22-year-old trying to save up, and the isolation didn't bother me, or so I thought. The property was old, and parts of it hadn't been developed in generations. The forest was thick and dark, full of old-growth trees that blocked out the sun even at midday. On the far edge of the land, maybe a 2-mile walk from my cabin, was the reason the place was so cheap. It was an old mine, sealed up tight with a massive concrete plug sometime in the 1940s, according to the owner. There were faded, rust-eaten signs warning of unstable ground and toxic air. I was told to stay well clear of it, which was fine by me. It gave the whole area a heavy, forgotten feeling. For the first month, things were completely normal. I'd walk the fence lines during the day, repair any wire that was down, and clear fallen branches off the main dirt road. At night, I'd read or watch movies on my laptop. The quiet was absolute, broken only by owls or the rustling of some animal in the underbrush. The first thing that felt wrong was small. I kept my tools, an axe, a post hole digger, and a shovel, leaning against the outside wall of the cabin under the eaves. One morning I came out and the shovel was lying flat on the ground about 10 feet away. I figured an animal, maybe a bear, had knocked it over. But there were no tracks, and the ground was soft enough that a bear would have left deep impressions. I put it back and didn't think much more about it. A week later, the axe was moved. Not knocked over, just placed neatly by the wood pile on the other side of the cabin. There was no way wind or an animal could have done that. It felt like a prank, but the nearest neighbor was 5 miles down the mountain, and the main gate was always locked. Then came the smells. It would happen randomly, usually in the late afternoon. A wave of a strange odor would drift out of the woods. It wasn't a dead animal, which is a smell I know well. This was different. It was musky, like damp soil and rotting mushrooms, but with a sharp, almost chemical undertone to it, like ammonia. It was thick and unpleasant, and it always seemed to come from the direction of the old mine. I started finding strange tracks in the soft dirt near the creek that ran through the property. They weren't from a deer, or a bear, or a coyote. They were long and narrow, almost like a bare human foot, but the toes were too long and slender, and the heel was almost non-existent. The strangest part was the gate. The tracks were almost in a straight line, one directly in front of the other, suggesting a way of walking I couldn't picture. I tried to follow them once, but they led into a dense thicket of rhododendron and briars that was impossible to push through, and the trail just vanished on the harder ground beneath. I started getting the feeling I was being watched. It's a cliché, I know, but it was a physical sensation. A prickling on the back of my neck that made me stop what I was doing and slowly scan the tree line. I never saw anything, just the deep, dark woods staring back. The nights became the worst part. I'd be lying in bed, reading by the light of a single lamp, and I'd hear noises outside. Not the usual animal sounds. It was a faint, intermittent scraping. It sounded like someone dragging a stick or a rock along the wooden siding of the cabin. I'd grab my flashlight and the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and fling the door open, but there was never anything there. The sound would stop the second my hand touched the doorknob. This went on for weeks. The moved tools, the smell, the tracks, the nightly scraping. I was sleeping with the poker next to my bed and had started propping a chair under the doorknob. I told myself it was a local playing games with me, trying to scare the new guy off the mountain. It was the only explanation that made any sense. One evening in late autumn, I was washing dishes after dinner. I was standing at the kitchen sink, which had a small window right above it that looked out into the yard and the woods beyond. The sun had just gone down, and the world was in that gray, dusky light where shapes get fuzzy and your eyes play tricks on you. That's when I saw it. It was standing at the very edge of the trees, maybe 60 yards away. It was tall and incredibly thin, and its skin was a pale grayish white that stood out against the dark trunks of the pines. It was humanoid, with a head, 2 arms, and 2 legs, but the proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, hanging down almost to its knees. Its legs seemed to bend at an odd angle, like a bird's. It was standing perfectly still, and it seemed to be looking right at the cabin. I froze, my hands still in the soapy water. I couldn't make out any facial features from that distance. All I could see was the pale, wrong shape of it. We stood like that for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 10 seconds. Then, it moved. It didn't walk or run. It sort of unfolded, dropping down low and scurrying back into the darkness of the woods with a speed that was completely unnatural. It moved like a spider. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the dark with the fireplace poker in my hands, listening to every creak of the cabin. The next 2 days were quiet. No scraping, no smells, nothing. I was beginning to hope that whatever it was, I had scared it off. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it, a trick of the fading light. Then the storm came. It was a bad one, a thunderstorm that rolled in fast and hard, bringing with it a torrential downpour and howling winds. The power went out almost immediately, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. I lit a couple of candles and sat in the main room, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. The wind shrieked through the trees, making them groan and sway. It was around midnight when I heard a new sound, mixed in with the chaos of the storm. It was a scratching, coming from under the cabin. It wasn't the sound of a raccoon or a possum seeking shelter. This was a deliberate, rhythmic, digging sound. Dirt and small rocks being clawed away from the foundations. It moved slowly, along one side of the cabin, then another. It was circling. My blood ran cold. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. The dirt road would be a river of mud, and I wasn't about to go out into that storm, not with that thing out there. The scratching stopped. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of the storm. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then I heard it on the wall, right next to the window. A slow, wet, dragging sound, like something slick and heavy being pulled up the wooden siding. It was followed by a soft thud against the window pane. I didn't want to look. I was paralyzed with a fear so total it felt like my heart had stopped. But I couldn't not look. I crept over to the window, staying low, and peered over the sill. A flash of lightning lit up the entire yard, and my mind just short-circuited. Pressed against the glass was a hand. It had 5 fingers, but they were twice as long as a human's, thin and spidery, with no visible knuckles. They were a dead, chalky white, and they were slick with mud and rain. The lightning faded, and it was dark again. I stumbled back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. Another flash of lightning, brighter this time, and I saw the face. It was just for a second, but it's burned into my memory. It was pale and hairless, with a smooth, almost featureless surface. There was no nose, just 2 small slits. The mouth was a thin, horizontal gash that was closed tight. But the eyes were huge, perfectly round and completely black. There were no whites, no iris, just 2 solid orbs of blackness that seemed to drink the light. They weren't looking at me with malice or hunger. They were looking with a kind of detached, intelligent curiosity, like a scientist studying an insect in a jar. It stayed there for hours. Every few minutes, a long, pale finger would tap gently on the glass, not trying to break it, just testing it. The storm raged on, and I sat on the floor in the middle of the room, clutching the iron poker, my eyes fixed on the window. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. As the sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, the tapping stopped. I waited until the sun was fully up, shining weakly through the clouds. I crept to the window and looked out. There was nothing there. The yard was a mess of fallen leaves and puddles, but the thing was gone. There were long vertical smear marks on the window and the wall below it, as if something coated in mud had been clinging there. I didn't even pack. I grabbed my wallet, my keys, and my phone. I left everything else. I got in my truck and drove. I didn't stop until I was 2 states away. I called the owner from a gas station, told him I quit, that I couldn't do it anymore. I didn't give him the real reason. What could I have said? He kept my last paycheck, but I didn't care. I've never been back to that part of the country, and I never will. I don't know what that thing was. I don't know if it lived in the woods or if it came from that sealed-off mine. All I know is that it was intelligent, it was curious, and it was watching me. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night and it's too quiet, I can still hear that gentle, testing tap on the window. My wife Jenna and I had saved for years to get our house. It wasn't huge, but it was ours, and it was exactly what we wanted. The property was backed right up against a huge stretch of state-owned forest, miles and miles of nothing but trees. The nearest neighbor was a good quarter-mile down the gravel road. For the first month, it was perfect. We spent our evenings on the back deck, just listening to the woods settle down for the night. We'd hear owls, the occasional yip of a coyote, the usual stuff. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones after years of living in apartments with paper-thin walls. The quiet was the first thing to change. It was Jenna who noticed it first. She was out on the deck one evening while I was cleaning up after dinner. She came back inside and closed the sliding glass door, locking it, which was unusual. She said, "Mark, did you see that?" I walked over from the sink, wiping my hands on a towel. I looked out into the deepening twilight. The thick wall of trees was just a dark, jagged line against the purple sky. "See what?" I asked. She was pointing towards a particular spot, a small gap between two massive oak trees that formed a sort of natural doorway into the deeper woods. "There was someone standing there," she said, her voice a little shaky, "just standing there, watching the house." I stared for a good long while, trying to see what she saw. I saw nothing, just trees and shadows. I told her it was probably just a trick of the light, the way the branches and leaves can look like a person if you glance at them quickly. She wasn't convinced. She said it was tall and pale, and it wasn't moving at all, which is what had freaked her out. A person would shift their weight or look around. This thing was just standing, like a statue. I put my arm around her and told her it was probably a hunter or a hiker who got turned around, and that he was long gone by now. I didn't really believe it, since it was getting too dark to be hiking, but I wanted to calm her down. We closed the blinds and put a movie on, and after a while, we kind of forgot about it. A few nights later, the second thing happened. We were both asleep when a sound from downstairs woke me up. It was a soft, scraping noise. It sounded like a branch being dragged slowly along the vinyl siding of the house. I lay there in the dark, listening. Our bedroom was on the second floor, at the back of the house, overlooking the same woods. The sound was coming from directly below our window. It went on for maybe a minute, a slow, deliberate scrape that moved along the wall and then just stopped. I thought maybe a deer was rubbing its antlers against the house or something. It was strange, but in a new place surrounded by wildlife, you expect strange noises. I didn't wake Jenna. The sound didn't come back that night. The next morning, I went out to look. I walked around the house, looking for marks in the siding or tracks in the soft dirt near the foundation. I found nothing. No scrapes on the vinyl, no footprints, nothing. Now I was a little unsettled. I was sure I hadn't dreamed the noise. It was so clear. I mentioned it to Jenna, and the color drained from her face a little. She connected it to the figure she saw at the tree line. I was still trying to be the rational one, suggesting it could have been anything, an animal, the wind. But even I was starting to feel a little knot of unease tightening in my stomach. That feeling of being out in the open, of having our little box of light and warmth surrounded by so much darkness and unknown. The real shift happened about a week after that. I was working late in my home office, which was a small room on the ground floor at the front of the house. It was almost 2 a.m. Jenna had gone to bed hours ago. I stood up to stretch my legs and walked into the living room to get a glass of water. Our living room had that big sliding glass door that led out to the back deck. We usually kept the vertical blinds closed at night, but a couple of the slats were turned just enough to give a sliver of a view of the backyard. As I walked past, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I stopped. My heart started beating a little faster. I walked slowly to the door and peered through the tiny gap, and then I saw it. It was standing at the edge of our deck, maybe 20 feet from the glass. Jenna was right. It was tall, unnaturally so. Easily 7 feet, maybe more. And it was bone white, a pale, sickly color that seemed to almost glow in the faint light from the moon. Its limbs were long and thin, jointed at angles that seemed wrong, like a spider's legs. It had no discernible features, no clothes, no hair, just a smooth, pale head on a long, thin neck. The worst part was the stillness. It was doing the exact same thing Jenna had described. It was just standing there, perfectly motionless, facing the house, facing me. I felt a kind of cold dread I've never felt before or since. It wasn't like seeing a bear or a mountain lion. This was something else entirely. This was something that shouldn't exist. I couldn't breathe. I stood there, hidden by the blinds, watching it for what felt like an eternity. It never moved a muscle, not a twitch. After maybe 5 minutes of this, which felt like 5 hours, I backed away from the door as quietly as I could, went upstairs, and got into bed. I didn't tell Jenna. I couldn't. I just laid there, wide awake, until the sun came up. From that night on, things got worse. We started hearing the noises every night. The scraping sound, a soft tapping that would move from one window to another. One night, we heard the handle on the sliding glass door jiggle. It was a faint sound, but unmistakable. A quiet, metallic turning, a gentle push. As if something was methodically, patiently, checking to see if it was unlocked. That was the night the peace of our new home completely shattered. We weren't living in a secluded paradise. We were living in a fishbowl, and something was outside, looking in. We started piling furniture in front of the sliding door at night. We checked every lock in the house 3 or 4 times before we went to bed. We bought thicker curtains for all the windows. Sleep became a luxury we couldn't really afford. We were both exhausted, paranoid, jumping at every creak of the house settling. The final straw came on a Tuesday night. I had to go into the city for a work thing, and I didn't get home until late, maybe around midnight. Jenna was already asleep. I was tired, so I just got ready for bed and tried to fall asleep myself. Sometime deep in the night, I was woken up by a sound that was different. It wasn't downstairs. It was close. It was a light scratching sound, coming from the window right next to our bed. My blood ran cold. I sat up slowly, my eyes locked on the window. We always left it cracked open just an inch or two for some fresh air. It had a screen, so we never worried about bugs. The scratching was on the screen, a delicate, insistent sound. I strained my eyes in the darkness. The moon was bright enough that I could just make out the shape of the window frame. And then I saw them. Long, white fingers. They were curled over the top of the window sash, from the outside, in that tiny 1-inch gap we'd left open. The scratching was the sound of its fingernails dragging against the screen as it tried to get a better grip. It was trying to push the window up. Slowly, silently, I watched as the fingers flexed, pulling at the window. The frame groaned, a tiny wooden sound that was deafening in the silence of the room. It was happening. It was actively trying to get inside, right there, just feet from where my wife was sleeping. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I was paralyzed by a fear so absolute it felt like my body had turned to stone. I just sat there in the dark, watching those pale, spidery fingers work at our window. Time seemed to stop. My entire world shrank to that window frame and the horrifying, patient intelligence behind that simple action. After a moment, the fingers slipped. They retracted out of sight. I waited, holding my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would break. Nothing. Silence. I stayed like that for the rest of the night, sitting up in bed, staring at the window, waiting for the sun to rise. The second the first gray light of dawn hit the sky, I woke Jenna. I didn't explain everything in detail. I just said, "We have to go, now." The look on my face was enough. She didn't ask any questions. We threw clothes, our laptops, our wallets, and our cat into the car. We didn't pack photos, we didn't pack heirlooms. We just took what we could grab in 5 minutes. As I was locking the front door for the last time, I glanced back towards the woods. I didn't see anything, but I could feel it. I could feel its presence, watching us leave. We got in the car and drove, and we didn't look back. We stayed in a hotel for a week before finding a new apartment back in the city. We hired a realtor over the phone and sold the house for a massive loss, never setting foot on the property again. The realtor asked why we were selling so soon. I just said we got a job offer we couldn't refuse in another state. I still have nightmares about those long white fingers, patiently trying to slide our window open.